Business AM. Think forward.
Welcome here at Business AM Radio. I'm Sofie Sonck, and the following hour consists of a dedicated talk with a Russian political analyst and former speechwriter of Vladimir Putin, Mr. Abbas Gallyamov. Welcome, Mr. Gallyamov, in the Business AM special on the war in Ukraine. We're about to focus on the Russian side of the war in Ukraine, more than a year after the invasion started. Mr. Gallyamov, you were a former speechwriter. You worked close with Mr. President Putin. How would you describe his character?
Well, I would say that he is like a chameleon. He's a very multifaceted person. He has many faces. So when I worked for him, all in all, for 3 years, 1 year when he was a president in Kremlin, and for 2 years when he was the prime minister in the government. So at that time, you could never imagine that he would be able to commit such acts of atrocities, which we are witnessing now. And when it all happened, I started thinking how it could be that that person who was absolutely rational, who was absolutely logical, he was like a real good manager, you would never think about anything bad about him. How could he become what he became? And I figured that probably it's not that he changed much. It's probably that just the other side of his personality got activated. At that time when I was working for him, he didn't feel threatened. His authority was not under question. He was solving important issues, but none of them was of some paramount importance or drastic consequence for him personally. So it's not like Ukraine or fighting Russian opposition, not question like this. So when he was doing them, he was very logical, absolutely not emotional, and he was he was not pressing on to people. He was trying to listen to their opinions. He was very attentive, but because he didn't feel threatened. But with the questions like Ukraine or with questions like NATO, or questions like Russian oppositions, it's totally different. Here he feels threatened, and here he's just switching over into some different mode. And here he becomes very authoritarian and very dictatorial, you can call it. And so it's not that he's changing, he's just switching.
Mm-hmm.
If, for example, he starts discussing some issue, something like petrochemical industry development prospect or agriculture or things like this, he would still be like he was at that time.
Mm-hmm.
But
was Russia a different country 15 years ago? At that time, there seemed to be a different narrative in play, with Putin trying to charm European leaders for business purposes and to sustain a peace relationship. But was he wearing a mask all the time?
Well, he has not yet just reached the point. He was still a relatively popular person at that time, a relatively popular politician. So he didn't need to employ authoritarian measures and to get hold of his power. He was winning elections. Of course, he was always using administrative measures of suppressing opposition, and he was using police to fight opposition, and he was stealing elections. But to a certain extent, it was not like absolute intervention. He was always getting more than 50% of votes through political means like propaganda and campaigning. And only recently, in the last few years, it changed. This police means, they became previously they were auxiliary forces, so to say. Now they became the main ones. And propaganda now is the auxiliary, which previously was the main one. So his state is becoming more and more repressive, just because it's how it's developing logically, so to say. Mm-hmm. It's just when your carrot is no longer working, you are using sticks more often.
Yeah.
That's what is happening, from carrots to sticks. That's the development. That's the dialectics.
How would you describe the current war? Is it arrogance or is it revenge? Is it the only option Putin had to silence his political opponents only? Or it turned out the wrong way? How do you see it?
Yes, it's. I'm absolutely sure that the real reasons why he started this, they have nothing to do with Ukraine, nothing to do with NATO. Russia was getting along with NATO for decades, and it was not like something extraordinarily difficult. So we know how it works, and we know how Ukraine works. We're dealing with it perfectly well. What changed in the last few years is the nature of political process. Russian public got tired of foreign policy, and they started paying attention more and more to domestic policy. And there in Russian, there is nothing which can convince Russians to put up with eternal rule of Putin. Like, what do we have in Russia? Growing divide between the rich and the poor, social inequality, poor economics, declining living standards. They're falling for something like 10 years already. Degrading social infrastructure, lack of prospects, corruption, and none of these things is working in favor of Putin. So since 2018, when this shift became visible, Putin's legitimacy was declining and his ratings were falling down. So he was really going to face serious problems with getting re-elected in 2024. So what he decided, he needed escalation to bring back the foreign policy into the center of political agenda in Russia. And he couldn't do this without escalation. So he needed to escalate. And it really worked, actually. Since January, his rating again started growing up, although before this it was mostly falling down. So this escalation really worked a little, but there he made a gross mistake. He started a real war. That's where he made a mistake.
Yeah, on CNN you called President Putin an old dictator. Is he as dangerous as a cold-blooded autocrat? He has unlimited government power. He commands the parliament, the Russian army, and the Russian people in a classic totalitarian way, openly even, the propaganda aside, of course. But is he still in control or is he losing power, do you think?
Oh, definitely his position is getting weaker. The last year showed to everyone that he was not as strong as we believed him to be. Everyone believed him to be, and his performance was very poor. Everyone expected the Russian army to overcome Ukrainian resistance within several days, and not for 1 year, and we still can't. Russia still can't cope with Ukraine. So definitely, it was a devastating year for Putin. Everyone saw that he, like the king is naked, and now he's. I'm not telling that he completely lost authority. No, he's on the way. But if previously the distance between him and the second and the third politicians in the country was like miles long, now it's just meters. He came much closer to the rest of Russian elites, and his authority is dying. Of course, his control over the system is dying. Everyone sees that he is at a loss, that he doesn't know where to go next, what to do next.
Is it desperation, you think, or not?
Sorry, I didn't hear the word.
Is he desperate? Is it desperation?
Yeah. Well, yes, he's really struggling, and sometimes it's visible that he's desperate. He's making a lot of mistakes. He's becoming very erratic. Like, for example, he's promoting one general, then he's demoting him in 1 month, then promoting him again, and like all this time. Also, the same happening in the government. He's promoting Mishustin, then he's promoting Medvedev on behalf of Mishustin, then he's again promoting Mishustin, limiting Medvedev, and like this. So he's obviously trying to do something, but he doesn't have strategy. So it's already, fuss. It's a do.
We are leaving this chat for just 1 minute. We'll be back with more on the Ukrainian war with my guest, political analyst Mr. Abbas Gallyamov.
Business AM. Think forward.
We are back with Mr. Abbas Gallyamov, Russian political analyst and former speechwriter of Russian President Putin. And we're still discussing the ongoing war in Ukraine. Mr. Gallyamov, how impacting are the economic sanctions with Russia? Do they hurt? Because Putin seems to brush off the sanctions as not hurting us at all. We have no problem. Is that the truth?
Well, so far they haven't yet started working to the degree that it becomes visible. So far, Russia had enough money to support the poorest groups of Russian population. So they're just giving money straight to people, and people, well, they still don't feel that like they're getting poor, and they feel vice versa. They feel that it's okay. They were trying to scare us away with their sanctions, and sanctions are not working. We're still doing well. But nobody, I think serious experts, they didn't expect sanctions to start working immediately. In the long run, they would work, of course. And Russian population is already, although it's trying to, to brush this aside to show that everything is okay, but still deep inside there is fear, and there is a growing sense of fear that life will become much worse, that their living standards will continue falling down further on. So in a year or two, this will start working against Putin himself. And this rally around the flag effect, which we certainly had at the beginning of the process, it will start growing weaker and weaker. In fact, it is already getting weaker and weaker, taking into account the fact that Putin cannot deliver the victory which he promised. And this process will be speeding up. It will be developing faster and faster because of the sanctions. So I'm sure that in the long run, they would work.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned before in interviews that a coup is even possible on the Putin regime, maybe even within the next 12 months. How do you see this possible? An actual attack on Putin's person, or political maneuvers to stop his actions?
When speaking about the coup, I was answering the question, what would happen if he cancels elections which are scheduled for the next year? And I told that now coup is it's hard to imagine it, because the Russian elites are greatly, of course they hate what is happening. Like almost 100% of Russian elites, they hate the idea of this war, and they think that Putin grossly miscalculated, and they lost their feeling that Putin is, like overnight Putin turned from the man who was stabilizing the system for the elites into somebody who became the chief destabilizer. So they're not happy about him at all, but still they're afraid of him. He is ruthless, and he controls all the means necessary to suppress any opposition. Mm-hmm. And the Russian military, they are really. You should understand, they cannot act. To overthrow a dictator, to perform a coup, you really need to believe into yourself. And they don't believe into themselves. You should understand that their self-esteem suffered a devastating blow in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. I think they have real problems with identity. So in such situation, people are not revolting. But what that would stop working in 1 year in half a year, maybe in 1 year after he cancels elections, because in this case, he will quickly, his type of legitimacy will start changing. He would quickly turn from a popular president, people's president as he is viewed now, into a dictator, real dictator, a usurper of power. And in this case, Putin he would become like the most hated man in the country quickly, and in this situation, the coup would become possible, and probably the Russian military would try to regain their identity, would try to regain self-esteem by opposing to the dictator. They just need another type of action. They need another enemy. They need the drastic change of the situation to regain back this feeling of self-esteem, so to say.
Yeah. And who could have the biggest motive to execute such an attack? The FSB? Or is this much more personal? Direct political opponents, maybe? Army people?
I wish I could tell you. Like it's all of these groups can take part in this. Like it's not going to be. You should understand the Russian institutions are very weak. It's all the time clans inside the institutions. So there will be certain groups, several clans of people across the institutional lines. Behind them, some people from FSB, some people from foreign intelligence, some people from the military for sure, some elite from his Putin's entourage. So these are the groups which can hardly be defined. You should understand it's very non-institutionalized system. This is what Russian politics is.
Yeah, but I cannot expect the Russian people to turn against Putin's regime. Navalny is holding up his spine, but nearly starving in jail, which has set an example for many other opposition leaders and strongholders who oppose his regime. So if anything happens, it's going to be a political or a military account that will be settled, isn't it?
Well, who expected the Iranian people to stand up back half a year ago, which we saw? Who could expect the Belarusian people revolt in 2020? And who could expect Russians to revolt 100 years ago after the First World War? Like got people tired. Like it's always happening all of a sudden. Believe me, like I spent many years working with the Russian population, making political campaigning, elections, and so on. So I spent a lot of time doing polling. People are not happy with what is going on with Putin. There are only like maybe 15% at most who really support the war. And at least 30% of those who are really unhappy with the war. And the majority is this middle ground. So everything depends on to where this middle ground will shift. And they're more and more displeased with the inability of Putin to win. And they're losing interest in this war. So as soon as the elite starts moving, popular revolt is absolutely becoming absolutely realistic. And maybe it will work by itself without elites moving. And maybe it will lead, this popular revolt will lead to elites beginning to move. So these two things, popular uprising and elite coup, they are like, you know, only in scientific literature there are pure types. In real life, there are always some kind of mixture of these two things. Either one starts, the other follows, or vice versa. So it's going to be something like this in Russia too, I think.
Yeah, and above all that, Putin is elite, just like other Russian leaders before him. So it seems like history is repeating itself in several ways. The Russian narrative of gaining back the huge Russian empire is what is at stake for Putin. Isn't it time for a new, more realistic narrative for Russia? I mean, a narrative that is much more in sync with modern times? Geopolitically, after World War II, Europe as a nation expanded in a huge way. And today, Europe for sure has no reason whatsoever to attack Russia. We don't need anything of it except for doing business, of course. There's no business Europe wants with Russia. Why is Putin still playing old empirical games? Is there no other way to build a Russian future?
As I'm telling you, this was the only way he could keep the Russian people around himself. This was the way he was trying to preserve his power, the most efficient way, the only way which he can think of. He was always ruling Russia, creating with the exception maybe of the first couple of years, when he was still new, the president of big hopes, restoring order, fighting inner enemies, like in Chechnya, or oligarchs or original governors who were splitting Russia. So after this, he started looking for foreign enemies, and he got used to this. This is the model he's trying to reproduce. Russians in general, without this all this propaganda, without all these repressions which are being thrown onto the heads of those who disagree with the domineering propaganda messages. Without this, Russian public, of course, they wouldn't think that, well, somebody is going to conquer us. People are getting more and more modern. That's why Putin really needed this escalation, because he wanted to reverse the tide, to reverse the wave which was already spreading. Like, our independent polling companies, for example, they are checking Russia's attitude towards America, Europe, Ukraine, China, like the main political players in the world. And the public opinion polls were showing that in the last several years, the general attitude towards all these places, all these countries was improving. December 2021, just 3 months before the invasion, both America and Ukraine, they got, so to say, from underwater, they went, I'm trying to choose the word, over water, if I can tell this, I don't know. So sorry for my English. I mean that more people were telling, yes, we like America, we like Ukraine, than people who were telling, no, we don't like America, we don't like Ukraine. So in spite of all the efforts of Russian propaganda, people were clearing up their minds and getting more and more friendly towards West Europe. And Europe was went from underwater several years before this. America and Ukraine were the last ones. So Putin needed to change this tide, this tidal wave, and that's why he started what he started. He was looking for escalation to stop time. He wanted to reverse time.
And is there a deadline you see for Putin? A breaking point? A point where either he wins or he loses?
Well, elections next year is a crucial moment, definitely. As for other moments, they are not determined by political logic. They are determined by the logic of war. I don't know, when the Russian army completely fails, this is going to be the moment, but nobody knows when it's going to happen. Definitely not me. I'm not an expert in military issues, unfortunately.
Okay. We are leaving this chat for just 1 minute. We'll be back with more on the Ukrainian war with my guest, political analyst Mr. Abbas Gallyamov.
Business AM. Think forward.
Welcome back. You're still listening or watching to Business AM Radio, and I continue my conversation with Mr. Abbas Gallyamov, the former speechwriter of Vladimir Putin. You said several times that the longer Putin sits, the better for a democratic Russia, and by his actions he discredits authoritarianism as the real option for Russia. He demonstrates the exhaustion of his option for the country's development. You went as far as to say that even war is good in this sense. Could you clarify this? Do the Russian people want democracy, you think?
Well, they are ready for something different. They were getting ready for this for a long period of time. It's like, waves. The first big wave, big democratic wave under Putin occurred back in 2011, 2012, when the Russian population revolted against Putin's coming back to presidency after his 4 years of premiership under President Medvedev. So it was a big decline in his popularity. He suppressed the revolt, and he was staggering. He was not successful for 2 more years till this story with annexing Crimea happened in 2004. And definitely this gave a big boost to his popularity. Russians switched over to this foreign policy mode. Russians have like two different types of vision of the world, which like totally not connect to each other. And Russian politics is mostly struggle for changing these two pictures in people's head. Picture one, it's foreign policy. It's when you are viewing the political process through foreign policy's lens. And in this case, Russian authorities, they are good, they are patriotic, they are against the enemies. But the different one is domestic one, when there are no foreign policies involved. And in this case, Russian authorities, they are corrupted, they don't care for people, and they are bad. And in the second case, the opposition is good. They're just people who despair and who revolt against this oppression. And in the first case, in the first picture, they are bad. They're foreign agent spies. So Putin is trying to impose this picture into their heads. And when they have this picture in their heads, they don't want democracy. But when they get the second picture into their head, when they overcome the resistance of Putin's propaganda, which was exactly the case between 2018 and 2022, to overcome which he needed the war. In this case, people want democracy. So it's not like very simple that they want democracy. In some cases they do, in some cases no. But in general, there are no obstacles which cannot be overcome on the way of democracy. And the main thing is that he is now really discrediting all this patriotic, what they call patriotic stuff, all this authoritarianism, all this strong hand, all this anti-Western attitudes, all this traditional values versus gay rights, as they are always trying to pose this. So he is discrediting all this, and by the time he is over, he finishes it, Russia will be ready for democracy for sure.
Mm-hmm. What is your point of view on the Russian army? It seems to be stalling. Equipment was not on par with a modern-day professional army. Some soldiers look like medieval people.
Putin is to blame. He can't blame anyone else for this poor performance of the Russian army. He for 25 years, for almost a quarter of a century, like 23 years, he was creating fake institutions in the country. He had fake parliament, fake courts, fake political parties, fake mass media. Everything was fake. And why on earth he was thinking that the army would be real? But no, it was not. It turned out he couldn't check it before the war started. But after he checked it, it turned out everything was fake too. Because it's a personalist regime. You should understand this. This is not like party autocracy, which used to be the Soviet Union. No, it's not ideological, it's personalistic. So the type of behavior he is displaying, it's reproduced on all the levels of bureaucracy, on the levels of elite. So people felt that it's just the rule of the game, just talk much and do whatever you need, like convert your administrative resource into money and send this money to Europe by their houses, invest into their businesses, send their children to their universities, let them make careers there. So that's what all the people were doing, including army officers. And nobody was thinking that that Putin would need a real institution. So, and nobody could believe that, are you serious? We're going to war? You probably saw, you remember the faces of his top officials, how shocked they were when he was announcing the beginning of the special military operation. So Russian army is absolutely inadequate, and this is just the result of Putin's policy.
Mm-hmm. Do you see any role for Belarus in this? Do you see a possible threat in this Russian ally?
Well, by himself, Lukashenko by himself, he is very cunning person, so to say. He's very treacherous. So he's not going into the war which Russia almost lost. He is not this kind of man who would risk himself like on behalf of Putin. So he would do all the talking, but he would make everything possible not to go into the war. And he has the excuse. Actually, he is telling Putin, like, look, just 2 years ago, they almost overthrew me. This popular revolt was extremely strong. I barely survived. So if I now give command for Belarus to attack Ukraine, what would the Belarusian military do? Maybe they would move towards Kyiv. And maybe they would turn their weapons against me and move towards Minsk. Because they see Belarusians, they don't have any grudge against Ukrainians. Why on earth they should go to war just because of Putin's ambitions? And they see how good Ukrainian military are performing. So what, the Belarusians should go to war just because one illegitimate leader is sending them on behalf of the other illegitimate leader, and we're going to die there. So we'd better support the revolt. Mm-hmm. So this is really the case when the revolution might happen. No one can rule out that it wouldn't happen. So I think this is a good excuse for Lukashenko. So I don't believe that he would join this war.
Okay. What to do with many radicalizations and strong nationalist voices taking place all over Russia? How strong is the right wing backing off Putin's policies?
This is mostly a fake, just like a lot of things which are in Putin's Russia. There are definitely people who think like this, but they are not numerous at all. 10% at most, and they're very passive. You should understand, as Russian liberal opposition, it's very active. They're coming out as soon as they feel that there is a small chance. They're coming out onto the streets. 23 years of Putin's rule saw dozens of revolts, sometimes very serious revolts by Russian liberal opposition, when hundreds of thousands of people were coming onto the streets fighting the police. Like thousands of Russians went to prison for this, including during the first weeks of war. Mm-hmm. And those right wings, they are very passive. They are too loyal. They are never coming out to exert pressure onto their political opponents. So all they can do is they are not even voting. Mm-hmm. Like back in the 90s, when politics was free in Russia, not a single nationalist party, although there were lots of them, won any elections. The most vocal Russian patriots nowadays, at those times, they were losing elections. So there is no mass following for these people, and all they can do is just perform, show their support of the war. Mm-hmm. But it's not something materialistic. It's not real. It's mostly a fake.
How do you see the negotiations regarding the prisoners from the Ukrainian Azov regiment? Putin released them. Did you expect that? Was it a signal by Putin to the West? What would you read in that signal?
Well, definitely. At that moment, Putin... Remember, at the beginning I mentioned that he was being erratic. So it's one of the examples. He was first. He was like, he created the big story, this cult of Azov, and all the Russian supported those people who supported the war. They were looking for the big trial and even executions and beheading of those Azov people. But at that moment, the war was so unsuccessful for Putin. He needed so much to show his ability to his desire to negotiate. So he ignored this public opinion he created by himself and decided to send them back. To when he told that it's like a signal to the West, yes, you're right. It was a signal to both the West and Ukraine that he was ready to negotiate, and he made this at his own expense, and he suffered a very serious blow in Russian propaganda wars, so to say.
Mm-hmm. Don't go away. We're leaving this program for just a minute. We'll be back with more on the Ukrainian war and my guest, Mr. Abbas Gallyamov.
Business AM. Think forward.
And we are back with Mr. Abbas Gallyamov, Russian political analyst and former speechwriter of Vladimir Putin. In this last part of this Business AM special on the war in Ukraine, we're discussing the actual situation in Russia more than a year after the invasion started. Mr. Gallyamov, I read that you said that the real war was not initially included in Vladimir Putin's plans at all. He just needed the escalation process itself. He was sure that Zelensky would break down and at least partially accept his ultimatum, and Putin would look like a kind of a winner of NATO. But that didn't happen.
Well, I meant that... Actually, I mentioned that when he started escalation, he started it at the end of 2021, when he issued his ultimatum and started amassing troops around the border of Ukraine. He is rating his popularity, which was going down for a long time before this. It went up. Within January, he got back something like 3 percentage points, and at the beginning of February he got it back. So this escalation actually worked. He broke the negative trend, and after he got into the war, which he cannot win, which ultimately leads to like his image of a strong man who is always winning. Which is the only source of his legitimacy, you should understand, in the eyes of both Russian public and Russian elites. So he is ultimately losing. So during escalation process, he was winning. Now during actual war, he's losing. That's what I meant when telling that his objective interest was in escalation, not in war. I think he felt it, that he was hoping that Ukraine, Zelensky would meet at least some of his demands, maybe not all of them, but at least some of them, and he would appear winner without necessity of attacking Ukraine. But after they refused, he had to attack, and now he is losing.
And how do you see the growing alliance with China? Putin still has a shot to win this war in case China and Iran succeed in delivering a massive amount of weapons under the radar.
Well, definitely Russia is not going to win no matter how many weapons China or Iran deliver to it. China actually needs Putin to continue. I think the interest of China is just this prolonged war. Interest of China is that America is preoccupied with Russia. As long as America is preoccupied with Russia, it creates no problem or little problems for China. And actually, now China is in the best situation. Both America is coming from one side and asks China not to support Putin. On the other side, Putin comes and asks China to support him. So China is getting attention from all sides. So they will be supporting Putin just as much as it's necessary for Putin not to fall completely, because this is going to be the big trouble for China. This democratic coalition, inspired by victory over this autocracy of Putin, they might really turn towards autocracy of C. And this is the problematic point. So in order at this moment not to come, never to come, never to appear, C will be supporting Putin, but just as much as it is necessary for Russia not to fail, because he doesn't want to get really involved in this war. Because why should he? The war is being lost. Putin is on the losing side. Why should China get all the arrows aimed at Putin onto itself?
But when will all of this end, you think?
Well, one deadline is elections next year, as I mentioned. But the major outcomes, they are determined by military logic and ability of the Russian army to resist. So experience tells that these things are happening all of a sudden, unexpectedly. I recall how Russia lost in the First World War. It was not a military defeat, actually. All of a sudden, a revolution happened. So from this point of view, maybe it will happen this year, maybe next year.
And who will be the next Russian president? Do you see any potential frontrunners already? Or will he step up and name a successor?
Look, Medvedev is really strengthening his positions over the course of 2 months. And so I think that possibly Putin is going to change the government and appoint the new prime minister again. And it will be Medvedev, and Putin will try to shift the responsibility onto him. He will appoint him not as a technical prime minister as it always was under Putin. No, it would be a political prime minister with his plenary powers to control the military and control the special forces, all the security agencies. And Putin will just tell, okay, go ahead and win the war, and if you win, you will become the next successor. Judging by what is happening in the last 2 months, a month and a half actually, at the end of December, Putin appointed Medvedev to the governmental commission, presidential commission, which controls all the big part of economics, this military-industrial complex. And Medvedev intervened onto the territory of the current prime minister. And if there is some logic into why Putin created this, then probably he's strengthening Medvedev on purpose. Although now I don't rule out that this is just a mistake, another mistake made by Putin. As I told, he is erratic. So maybe it's going to be Medvedev.
Yes. What is your point of view on Mr. Navalny? Is he a true Russian hero for the people? Could he be the future, or will he get killed eventually?
Well, yes, he is a hero, but still with high anti-ratings. And now Russian public is like in any authoritarian country, it's the public which likes bandwagon effect. And when Navalny is winner, he is gaining. Now when he is in prison, he is losing. But still, he is the king of the street, so to say. There are no other politicians who can control the street. I mean, the people on the street so efficiently as Navalny does. So when Putin's regime starts collapsing, the street will definitely be, the role of the street will increase highly. And it might work just like in South Africa with Mandela. He was in prison and then the street demanded him be free and he became the next president. So chances of Navalny, if he survives this prison, although nothing is ruled out now, we see Putin, he doesn't care for people's lives at all. So if he survives the prison, he might become the kingmaker and the king by himself.
Is there anything the West can do to break Putin's power?
Well, number one, go on supporting Ukraine. Number two, probably it would be efficient if the West offers some exit strategy for the Russian elites. You see, the problem is that they found themselves between the devil and the deep blue sea. On Putin, whom they are afraid of on the one side, and the West with all its sanctions and all its pressure on them on the other side. So they don't see what they can do. They are lost. If the West tells, like those of you who take part in overthrowing Putin, if they clearly indicate that we would forgive you, we would allow you use your capitals, which is here, and you will get like political asylums and so on and so on. Like, go ahead, make it. So they need some encouragement on one side. Putin is trying to encourage them, pointing at the West. Look, the West is unfriendly towards you. So the West can do the same on the opposite side. Probably this would really raise chances that the Russian elites might make a coup.
Mr. Gallyamov, if you could write one last speech for Putin, how would that message sound today?
Of course, I'm sorry, I'm leaving. I'm a criminal, put me to prison. Something like this.
That's quite impressive. Thank you very much for having this conversation with me, Mr. Abbas Gallyamov. I wish you all the best with writing and opposing. I'm sure you have a future of a much different Russia in mind. Stay safe, and our hearts are with your kind of Russia.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Business AM. Think forward.